So we're actually experimenting with the Powell device today, so we're actually gonna record this, so if anyone doesn't want to be recorded, you have to go hide behind the blackboard. So today's session is, what can system thinkers learn from,
Wisdom studies.
wisdom studies. And so, this is part of the series of System Thinking Ontario. We've been running System Thinking Ontario since 2012 officially, monthly. We get together, and originally this is the way we used to meet. We used to meet in a circle and just discuss. Then when COVID hit, we had all went online, so we're back now to actually going back to the roots. So the usual format we're going to have, what we'll do is firstly we'll go around in a circle and just introduce ourselves briefly so everyone knows who we are. Then we're going to have 3 questions. I'll moderate. We have Igor Grossman and we have Zaid Khan. I'm David A. And I'll bounce you around and we'll go on 3 rounds of questions. I'll pose a question. They'll have some perspectives on it, and then people can ask whatever questions they want.
Be wise.
Oh, you don't have to. Well, there's a question, but we don't have that. Okay, and we have some people just coming in on the bus. So open up more space.
There's some chairs here. They're gonna run it. Yeah, I'm checking it. We have a spot for you,
Yeah.
If you.
So we'll just start off with introductions and come on, why don't you introduce yourself? And so the question of the day would be, how did you come to systems thinking or wisdom studies? So.
I'm a graduate of the strategic course language program of the university, and that's how I got to know systems thinking Ontario, and I also worked with Zaid and some side projects. Yeah.
Hello everyone, my name is Zach. I came to this meeting by my mom introducing me to Zaid. We had some email exchanges and I decided to show up 2 days ago, so I'm here to just serve as
I've infected another one.
willingly. Well, I'm a regular, so maybe. My name is Sean. I came to systems thinking because I work in the environmental sector. So we use that in design. I had a biopsy on my face, so I had this the question that everyone.
You're feeling okay?
Oh yeah, it's just in the worst possible.
Hey everyone, my name's Scott. I'm an account director at a creative agency. I work with that. And so for me, systems thinking is pretty new for me, but just in general, working with strategists at our creative agency is part of the process. So this is a great opportunity to learn a little bit more about system thinking and how it's applied, so that when I work with system thinkers, I have a better understanding of the process and how it.
Hello, everyone. I'm Nishad. I actually came to systems thinking through people here, David Ain, Zaid Khan, Elena, and Kelly. I've been a long follower of them. Been following them since the pandemic, online and also meeting in person.
Go ahead.
My name is Igor Grossman. I'm a professor of psychology. And I have no idea what systems thinking. I know a little bit about thinking because I study how people think and how they can think better. And I guess there was a question how I got to wisdom. It's a long story, so I will not bore you, but it was very serendipitous. I wanted to study cultural differences, and then one thing led to another, and somebody suggested I should study about look at age differences in wisdom because there's some similarity. Again, I don't want to go too much detail, but and then I started looking, and I realized that how people have studied wisdom was wrong. That was not very wise of me. There's kind of no humility there whatsoever. I was just thinking, this is all bad science, and we can definitely do things better. And I tried to introduce different methods and continue doing that, borrowing from different disciplines, which led me to computational sciences, led me to various aspects of social sciences that beyond my experimental training. And let me here because I'm curious, learning more about system thinking, which, as I said, I have little knowledge of. I'm very curious. Thank you for having me.
Hi, I'm Kelly Okamura. I had a wandering path like yourself. I come from design intelligence in terms of trend forecasting. I came through design and dialogue, and that's what led into systems Ontario. I've been following that pathway for 10 years. I think still in the weeds.
Hi everyone, my name is Anna. I have an extremely long last name, so Anna B is fine. I am currently a student, part-time student of vocab as a prior program. So some feedback you heard earlier that possibly was about me. I also founded the Canadian Foresight Network because I got into foresight through the corporate world. And I work typically in consumer packaged goods, and then I decided that I need to build a better foundation for my knowledge, and I enrolled into the program. So it's a slightly different way. And I think this is how I got recruited, or infected is the word that we're using, into systems thinking, just really building the right foundations.
I'm Elena Leonard. I've been around the systems and cybernetics community for a while. And I am actually just recently putting together a cybernetics framework for RED and trying to bridge between first and second order cybernetics. And I went back to Aristotle, man is the measure of all things. And I thought that that was a very good bridge because people make models, but they select what features are important, what feedback loops they want to monitor, and that they are the source of measurement because it's what they want to do and what they need to make them get there.
I'm Penny Colville. Right now I have a company that makes games of skill and chance to help people speak English better. I got introduced to systems in the early 80s when Stafford Beer and Gordon Cass were both at Concordia University, where I did my MA in tech. And I mostly applied systems thinking and practice to large corporate training projects. So.
Hello, I'm a graduate of the SFI program. I'm a systems thinker. It's my background as in international studies, and then I did a law degree and did the SFI program, and I worked for the government for a little while. In CRA on systems and trading systems. And I'm more interested in wisdom.
My background is in engineering and now working in finance. I found out about system thinking this week actually from Melia, who invited me here today. And I'm always in pursuit of learning more and gaining more knowledge, especially in things that I'm not familiar with. So I'm coming here with the heart and mind full of curiosity, learn more about systems thinking, and to be here.
You go, then I'll go back to you. Okay.
My name is Zaid Khan, and I have hiccups today. And there's a lot of wisdom out there about like how to treat hiccups, but I'm not sure if they're humility that like it may not work for everyone because they're like, this is the definitive way. This is the definitive way. Like drink upside down, throw salt, like do a dance. I don't know, weird stuff. But the one that works for me, which is working right now, is very moment, is to be distracted and like doing something. So let's see if that sticks. I came to systems, I'm a graduate of the SFI program. And so the program here, and I came to systems through Dr. Peter Jones. And so he exposed us to the systems thinking course. And ever since then, I've been working with David Ames, advanced and a branch of systems thinking that we've been working on along with Kelly and Dan Ing, who's not here today, over the last 7 years, actually. And it's a 10-year project. And so I don't know if it was wise to set such a long-term horizon, but we're in the midst of that. And I also co-organize these sessions. And so I'm happy to give Dr. Grossman a lot more of the airtime because I'm a recurring person.
Yeah, I'll also introduce yourself and just how you go to system thinking or wisdom studies.
So I'm also an SFI graduate, and then came to Systems Thinking Ontario through Peter Jones as well, and then kind of came back again through Zaid herself. So working as a consultant in system, well, not in systems thinking, but applying it in a lot of the work that we do as well.
And I'm David Ing, been around systems since 1999, and I guess for my first appointment, I'm actually now an adjunct professor at OCADU as of March 1st, for 3 years. I still haven't got my key card.
I need to really inside. I think something's not.
It's not something not working. Okay, so for the first question, which is about wisdom studies, but I'm going to bounce back to Zaid because what were you thinking? Like, so there's a system thinking group, you bring a wisdom studies person in, what were you thinking?
Yeah. So a lot of my answers will come from like a systemic design perspective about systems thinking. And I ended off my major research project and how I went through the design program, looking back on how there seems to be an absence of intellectual humility regard. So the title of my own thesis was like responding to complexity with humility. And I landed on humility, and I even have a lecture next week on more humbling design. So it's through humility that I discovered wisdom studies. And I believe you can speak more to the University of Chicago has some wisdom studies. So I just was looking at the field and scanning of it, and I saw that they had a lot of features and characteristics about intellectual humility, taking multiple perspectives, recognizing the context, trying to discern different motives and ethics and morals. So there's just a lot of features of it. And I've been, as someone who just scans broadly, I just saw a lot of connective tissue with wisdom studies.
So I turned to Igor to explain wisdom a little bit, but I'm gonna actually do a little bent because I actually did some, on the website, there's always some advanced readings, so I did a little bit of advanced readings. And so the talk that I actually made was, since the supervisor was Richard Disney. And so I was looking at his work originally because I've been looking at the Chinese philosophy and how Chinese think differently. So I noticed that some of your research now is basically on wisdom and culture and how they're in different places in the world. So
Should I start about the culture or about the wisdom part?
wherever you want to start.
Well, as I said earlier on, when I introduced myself, I'm just kind of interested in the notion of cultural differences. Being sort of migrant myself, I moved from Ukraine to Germany, migrating since. It's always been on my mind what I count as the larger cultural system you're part of, that you're in, influences how you perceive the world. This kind of this naive thing, but it stuck with me, and I want to be a cultural psychologist, and I still am a cultural psychologist, which means I study how people make sense of the world through the cultural lens that they grew up with, that they socialized in, and they encounter in their day-to-day interactions, ecology, everything, the way how buildings are made, and the products are presented in the shelf. It's everywhere. And then when I started graduate school, I came with like, I want to do culture. Like, well, that's very nice, but we got this new grant on aging and wisdom. Why? Because that time NIH actually gave money to psychologists to study something, which they don't do more, as we all know. And they got a big grant for that. And there were parallels between the idea, as you mentioned, sort of this kind of Chinese philosophy, like not necessarily about the philosophy, but everyday thinking among the folks from China and East Asia and North America. So that on the other hand, there were these kind of differences that my former supervisor and others have observed. For instance, being more holistic, not necessarily focusing on some kind of central features, but instead of that, thinking about the gestalt, sort of like the overall system, so to say, and how different features fit together, and prioritizing that over whatever is the most salient thing that you should do. Being sort of more dialectical in the sense that you are not necessarily always thinking like, okay, we have to absolutely identify who's right and who's wrong. Sometimes kind of we need to compromise. And that was in culture. And then at the same time, some researchers on aging, when they talked about wisdom as a form of advanced expertise in life, where you don't just like learn how to be more analytical, logical, but things that you learn actually through your experiences in everyday life over the course of your life. And there were some attempts to sort of formalize that. But, oh, yeah, that's actually what wisdom is about. Right? What is it? What is it actually about? And it turns out people like, well, it's kind of about being relativist, about being paying attention to the context, being more holistic. Like, wait a second, that's a kind of like similar to what the cultural people were talking about. And so that's why they got the money to try to scale it up and study this kind of age and wisdom effects across cultures. That's why I came in and I started doing my work on that. One thing led to another, you know. But I don't know if that totally addresses your question. So it's like how do they get to wisdom is complicated. Serendipitously, as much of wisdom is about serendipity. So in that sense, of course, it is recognizing the uncertainty and trying to figure out how to manage it. Recognize you actually can't control your narrative all the time. Sometimes you just have to go with the flow and be flexible in your orientation. So in some ways, that's what led me to this.
Okay. So how does that factor into what you've been thinking about wisdom and your interest in it?
There's a lot there.
Yeah.
I think again, coming at it from a systemic design perspective, I think the field that we come from as designers, or those, especially of us who are here from the graduate program at OCAD, there's this inherent bias to action in design. So there's always a tendency to trying to be doing something to affect an outcome. And I started to think about, or started to look into how something like wisdom studies can be a way of perhaps appreciating whether or not there's value in what I'm working through, including with the work that you're surfacing in Chinese philosophy about the value of knowledge, or value, but deliberately not affecting something so that it can, naturally unfold in a way that may be perhaps beneficial. And that's a different orientation altogether of design, and one that is not baked into the schools or the institutions that we work from. So I think that's a connection point, because in that are aspects of, and perhaps you can share more about the definitions of wisdom, but in that is an aspect of trying to do trying to affect the least problematic outcome. So when, as social system designers, we often will say that we're working in a complex environment. So any one move you make is going to have an effect on the system in some anticipated and unanticipated way. And so I suppose that because there's no right or wrong, as you were saying, what is a suggestion or a way forward that is gonna perhaps do the least harm or the least damage on it? And you surface this about the aging wisdom about a Hippocratic oath, for example. And in contrast, I don't see us in design or systems community perhaps taking a stance about really thinking through whether or not our actions are having those types of consequences.
Oh, well, well, there are multiple things. So I mean, if you want me to, there are different definitions. It's a loaded term. And I've been suffering through this for the last decade, if not longer, because when you say you study wisdom, oh yeah, okay, yeah, sure. But the reason why it's a loaded term is because everybody has some kind of a perspective what it is, and at the same time, nobody wants to define. We use this term in everyday language whenever we want to describe something that is good, optimal, often post hoc, so after the fact, and often unattainable to you, but somebody else's wise there, and they know. Functionally, the way I'm thinking about the style is it helps to think about, well, what is the realm within which we, and by we, I don't just mean here in Canada, here in this room, but like in general, people in different cultures tend to use the term wisdom. When do we call, what kind of situations call for wisdom? That often helps me to reflect, to start my reflection of defining. And there I would posit that it's not really just a situation where everything is well known, but we can sort of use a calculus, mental calculus or actual calculator, or some kind of a supercomputer, but rather it's a situation with too many messy parameters, where you can't really create some kind of decision tree, some kind of a system, a robust system that you can apply again and again and again and again. Instead of that, it's just like multiple unknowns. And those situations are present in various aspects of our life. Right? So it's not just like this kind of super heavy thing. I want to move to Canada. Should I move to Canada? Should I not move to Canada? A lot of parameters. Will my future self like me moving to Canada? Which is quite a very complicated decision problem. Because your future self, you have no idea what your future self would be like. And that totally destroys the notion of subjective utility that decision scientists, for instance, operate under. If you want to calculate what gives you the greatest benefit for something, you need to know the utility of each action. Okay, fine, imagine you can calculate that, but you also need to assume that your future self will like it. But what if your future self will be transformed through you making the decision? And that's exactly those type of situations, like moving to a new country, like, giving birth, coming out, all sorts of like decisions, major decisions. But in addition to that, even in everyday situations, we have, for instance, imagine we have a disagreement about something, or we have different opinions about something. And without me knowing exactly what your preferences are, and how much you want this versus that, and what your stakes are, it's almost impossible for me to create some kind of a calculus about how should I operate. Because I can only do it in a so-called well-defined small world space, where I know the parameters of every single agent involved, and I can calculate the consequences of those actions. AKA an impossible scenario that none of us actually does in everyday life. Because when we have a disagreement, when we generally have disagreements, we just operate under some kind of assumptions. We try to perspective take potentially or not. Sometimes it fails. We guess, we use so-called heuristics or rules of thumb, and so on and so forth. So the decision space of wisdom, the function, is to figure out how to solve those, I think in all countries you like the term wicked problems or ill-defined problems. And then the next step is like, well, what could be the ingredients to do that? What kind of, let's say I'm a psychologist, psychological processes can help you. We can talk about structural processes, systems can be structural, but I'm a psychologist, so I'm talking about psychological processes. And on the level of psychology, when you think, okay, this is about sort of like figure out this ill-defined situations where values are not really clearly easy to articulate, or you cannot even compare it because it's apples and oranges. What would be those psychological processes? Well, some of them, turns out, operate under this a larger rubric. And this rubric is what I would describe as social metacognition. Social because they're almost always in a social space. Even when you mentally think about it by yourself, but you still involve other people. Metacognition, it's not just cognitive process, but it is a set of characteristics that help you to regulate input of information, regulate when to engage or when to let go, like you were saying before. So sometimes I'll let it go. And it's very, very hard, but I'll let it go. It will solve itself somehow. You need to know when to do that. That brings us, by the way, to Aristotle. Because for Aristotle, the key definition of phronesis of practical wisdom was like in serenity prayer, to know the difference between the situation when you should do X versus should do Y. And so psychologically, what this translates to is to be able to regulate your input of information and discern the context from which it comes from, and regulate what kind of strategies should you be applying in order to reach a particular outcome in that situation, and then also regulate whether that application of the strategy is measured to the context, as the situation unfolds. Okay, so there's a whole range of features that may be part of it, but for me right now, I spoke a lot, so that would be sort of the current definition. Now, one thing I want to say on top of that is there is a large group of people who talk about this kind of ethical and moral grounding of this. And there are debates to what extent you need the so-called moral blueprint in order for a situation to be called wise. That again goes back to Aristotle, who was very much an essentialist type of guy, by which it means that he also believed that there's certain homunculi in our brain, and the whole world is just considered, for him, it's a system. He didn't really believe in systems that much, like a bunch of marbles everywhere, with a separate. But for Aristotle, for instance, and for a lot of people who are following that tradition, you can only talk about wisdom if it has some kind of moral intention, if it's grounded in a certain set of moral values. The way I'm thinking about it is, it's complicated, it's messy. What do we mean by moral? Whose morals? Just morals by itself is potentially problematic. There are a lot of people who do a lot of morals without this metacognition, and it backfires. A lot of examples of people trying to be very moral and better than holier than others, and they don't know where to stop, when to regulate themselves. It's regulatory function. This is the mark. We also have examples where you can have moral desirable outcomes that would be achieved through completely selfish means, completely selfish intentions, if metacognition is engaged. For instance, the classic economic game theory, there are so-called folk theory and postulates, which is basically, if you know anything about game theory, this is like so-called prisoner's dilemma, or also like, should you be de facto cooperate if the other person de facto cooperates? This is sort of like what a lot of discussions about, engaging with an antagonistic party during the Cold War were based on. And you can start with sort of like one single shot interaction. And there, for instance, let me give you an example. Imagine very simple example. You and I don't know each other, but we're both part of the study, and I was through sort of random selection, that I'm now the person who dictates how much money I can share with you. And I was given $10. And now I could share some of this money with you, or I could just keep it all for myself. You will never find out. Never find out. It's called the dictator. How much money should you be giving to the other person? Never find out. So economically rational would be not to give anything. You'll never find out. It's your money. What are you doing? However, people often give up to half. So people give a little more because they kind of be both part of this. We are randomly assigned. It's totally unfair. Why should I be taking all the money? Now, but even from the economic perspective, this game totally changes when it's not just one single shot situation, but there are multiple rounds and interactions. And so it turns out that, yeah, economically it's beneficial for me to take all the money. But if I do this multiple times, she'll find out, and she'll punish me. Because next time she's randomly assigned to be the dictator, she thinks, oh, okay, so he took all the money, I'm taking it. So actually, in the long term, it's totally beneficial for me to cooperate and be nice and share and be fair, right? Now, thinking about this as a short-term single-shot interaction versus long-term interaction is a form of metacognitive process, right? Balancing my short-term interests, and now we can expand this to any type of decision systems, right? Not just about your momentary preference and momentary situation, but about the long-term consequences thereof. And if you start thinking about it in terms of those long-term consequences, you very quickly realize that even if you totally don't care about morals of others, it would be totally beneficial for you to cooperate with others and embrace some kind of general norms. So for me, the moral grounding that often comes in, often as an outcome of metacognitive engagement, as long as one lives in an environment where people have to see each other once in a while and will be punished if they don't cooperate, play nice with others. I'll stop at this point.
So I'm going to invite others' ideas about, I'll take the first one, which is, so what I'm hearing from your description of wisdom is just a lot related to judgment and experience and decision.
Yeah.
And so the question would be, is that something that individuals can improve or groups can improve, or is research going that direction?
Yes. There's evidence that some of this you can improve as an individual. I mean, there are a lot of contemplative traditions, like Marcus Aurelius kept a diary, and there's kind of reflective exercises, as many skeptics did back in ancient Rome, back in Greek traditions. There are mindfulness exercises that people with contemplative traditions in South Asia have engaged in, Southeast Asia, like mindfulness practices, various of mindfulness practices that really try to train your, again, like metacognition, regulation of your thought, when to engage, when to disengage, how to process this information, how to let go of this information, how to look at yourself, not necessarily as in the center of attention, but getting this kind of fly on the wall vantage point. So those traditions have existed for a very, very long time. For psychology, only the last 100 years we started doing sort of like empirical studies of that. The psychology is fairly new as a discipline, and we do see some small incremental effects of training. For instance, if you keep a diary that changes your perspective for a while, it may work. Keep a diary in the third person, for instance, that can change your metacognitive engagement later. On the group level, I mean, I don't know as many studies that actually show that how it works. But theoretically, of course, if you set up the structure of the organization, that would be more open to dissent or disagreements, so that you're actually comfortable telling your boss that they're wrong. That theoretically should promote greater creativity, better engagement, greater error correction. I mean, off the record, I heard from several companies or let's say more consulting companies that did review of practices in major companies in the US and Canada that told me privately that you study intellectual humility, and I really found that that is the thing that seems to work well in groups, but that work is not published. And I'm not sure if it will ever be published because of this, but in this small circle, I'm share this, I didn't say any names, so I think I'm okay. Yeah, so apparently it also works there. At least for me, it's so far anecdotal. I don't see that it will evidence. On societal level, I'm not sure. Clearly, we incentivize being right and confident instead of expressing uncertainty nowadays more than acknowledging uncertainty. But there are cultural differences, which gives me hope. For instance, over the course of the pandemic, different countries handled expressing uncertainty about how well the certain policies will work more than others. So for instance, in Denmark, there was great appreciation of mentioning caveats than either Fauci did in the US or we did here in Canada. And apparently that led to increased trust instead of decreased trust. And there was a worry that if you mention caveats, that would decrease trust among the constituents in actually following the policies. Now, this in Denmark was not the case. But I think there are cultural differences also, and we need to appreciate that and maybe learn from them. I do think it's a problem, but it's more like my meta criticism of our societies that I remember I once talked to teachers in Florence, large conference. And I said, well, intellectual humility really important. I was like, but what do you do when we have oral exams? In oral exams, you kind of present yourself in the most confident way. Like, because like half of the game is actually presenting yourself as if you do know instead of recognizing that you don't know. How do you do this? It's a societal problem.
I just want to make a probably minor point about, you're talking about the role of culture and wisdom, deciding wisdom. And I keep thinking about how we talk about the wisdom of Solomon and the story of the baby, the two women arguing over who owned the baby. And Solomon's wise decision was to cut the baby in half, which is decidedly not doing the least amount of harm, but doing the maximum. But he knew it would work because he knew human nature. He knew that the real mother would never allow this, regardless of. So I just want to put a plug in for understanding human nature, not just inputs and outputs and decision trees and way, but understanding who you're dealing with.
No, absolutely. I mean, that's definitely true. I mean, of course, in this story, it can be interpreted in so many different ways. Some people, for instance, have interpreted, and I say that I've written a paper known as Solomon's Paradox. I'll get to that later. You know, what's so paradoxical about Solomon? It's kind of funny. But for instance, the same story can also be interpreted as his decision, his judgment was very paradoxical and crazy, it seems. Right? Well, just cut it in half. Like, we would say that.
Someone who knows human nature.
That's right.
Would say.
Right, but I mean, I felt like that's almost like if you were to stop there, imagine it was a joke about Solomon instead of the wisdom of Solomon, you could just make a joke. It's like, and guess what you said? Just cut it in half. That was a punchline. And we will not learn much about the subsequent reactions, of course, which is what they reveals his wisdom, knowing more about the human nature.
I think that's a good reduction. Cannot consider the whole process.
Of course, but I think like there's an arc to the story. That's what I'm trying to say, and it starts with this kind of ridiculous, which then leads to actually it's not ridiculous at all. It reveals who the actual mother is. Now, what's really paradoxical about Solomon, if you like, is that he was miserable in his own life. I mean, he was not miserable. I think he was miserable because if I had 500 pagan wives, I would be miserable. I mean, But anyway, but he did, being the chief priest of the Jewish kingdom. And he was also like really fond of saying how awesome and wonderful, how great his kingdom was. Like anybody comes in from another country, he would show them all their wealth. It's a small country, it's like, we don't do that. So there's a lot of things about sort of he known for his wisdom, people come to him, but then he is also known for his folly, his personal life, many aspects of it. So even knowing, interpreting it through, which I agree with. That's right. Yeah. So what I'm trying to say exactly that knowing potentially having deep insight into the human nature of others does not necessarily make you immune to the folly in your own life. And part of this is for me insightful in another way, namely that it's highly context dependent. And who we, for instance, consider wise, maybe wise in one domain, but surely not in all domains. And we should not be discounting also somebody's wisdom just because in some domains that person showed something that we would be considering very foolish, which is very hard to do, especially when it comes to the moral aspects.
Vanilla brought up human nature. But what occurred to me from your definition of wisdom is, knowing and understanding context and human nature. It doesn't sound like wisdom is a human thing because the way you describe it is not, necessarily connected to abstract thinking. It's more like understanding and navigating the context.
Mm-hmm.
And so if any creature, well, an advanced creature or, I haven't thought that far, but so any being that understands and navigates context in a reasonably beneficial way could be considered wise. So, for example, for Solomon, knowing human nature was important because he was in a human society. For like a horse and a paddock, knowing equine nature is important if it's in equine society. And so, let's say an older horse who has more experience with different species of its own kind would be behaving more wisely than somebody who's not able to navigate. I don't know, just
I mean, I would not necessarily disagree with that, but I think it's so some elements of being sensitive to context and regulating yourself are definitely present across the animal kingdom. And I mean, I just pushed for an argument that we should, if you really want to save ourselves in the threat of possible whatever AI altogether, if there is such a thing. If there is such a worry, we should be building this medical features into AI systems to also help them not hallucinate as much. But I think it is a matter of degree also, in the sense that, for instance, I don't think such things as intellectual humility, so I recognize the limits of your knowledge and uncertainty and sort of like correcting it, can be as refined, at least as far as I know, in many of the other animal species compared to Homo sapiens sapiens. So far, at least I haven't seen that. Maybe there are some, but so it's not just about being able to recognize the context, but it's also about this kind of processes. How do you deal with perspectives of others? And I'm not saying that. I mean, like dogs, for instance, and other apes have some capacity for perspective taking, absolutely. But we have to do all that as adults, at least as adults, compared to, for instance, beautiful fur trend. So to some extent, it's a matter of degree. And for some of this metacognitive capacities, for instance, like abstract metaphors that you can then apply to a given context, extrapolate from them, and so forth. I do think
we are very complex, right? So on an individual level, of course, you versus a dog. yes, but what about, on the level of system, let's say, would you be able to navigate, I don't know, a forest terrain as well as a pack of dogs and a hunt? Or, like mother nature, right? The wisdom of nature, like, let's say like an ecosystem, it can like, self-correct and do all sorts of things. So maybe because we carry a lot of complexity in ourselves, we are able to be wise individually, but let's say more simple beings, organisms, they would need to achieve a certain level of collective complexity to parallel what we can do.
Possibly, I mean, that's an interesting proposition. At what level, I want to possibly test this, at what level would the simplicity of individual level of expression of this medical features be less optimal for the system or for the group of individuals who would be potentially on a group level be able to maintain some kind of, interesting. I don't think there are mistakes to it. I mean, but we can test that. I could certainly make an argument that humans also live in groups and could possibly also regulate. And if they all have higher metacognitive capacities, that actually is the thing that help them coordinate with each other better and secure their evolutionary survival for millennia, given that we're not the strongest of the animals and not potentially the most resilient of the animals, and nevertheless, we kind of did fairly well. And why did we fairly well? Because we had to plan ahead, and also because we could coordinate with each other. So like this again, like this metacognitive process, because coordination requires paying attention to others and trying to figure out the perspectives of other individuals. Possibly better than some of the other animals. At least some of the theories suggest so. But it's an important question. Or a sort of a formal question. Test if you want.
Together. So the wisdom is it's about discernment. It's about cultivating discernment with lots of different parameters, but also realizing what are the relevant parameters to take into account and to maximize efficiency or desirable outcome. I think working with a large organization, complex problems, navigating lots of different parameters, social, and personalities. And then we come to a decision and where, project sort of unfolds, and there's this feeling like, did we really make the decision or did the decision arise? And where did that wisdom come into? And then there's this feeling of humility in doing that. Is that the collective wisdom that you're talking about, or like I'm trying to like sort of differentiate, like where does my individual wisdom come in versus the collective wisdom of the group coming into systems design? Where did the two meet?
That's an interesting question. I don't know. Also, I want to flag that the term collectivism is another definition, and that often means something else. Collective wisdom, there are a lot of different sort of versions of it. For instance, so if you're interested in foresight, so am I. And in foresight classic studies suggest that if you gather opinions of random people from the street who don't know each other and aggregate them together to guess the weight of a horse, they'll actually be closer to that than any of the individuals. That's called the classic definition of the wisdom of crowd. That's a form of collective wisdom, literally wisdom in term, but it's of course very different from what we're talking about here. The idea there is that each single person may have some kind of slightly different angle and sort of like all that noise that they will bring in, even though they are pseudo-random, it cancels each other out and you sort of get that some kind of approximation that's closest to your prediction will be closest to the actual truth. Anyways, but collective wisdom is also often meaning something that sort of as you said, emerges on the level of the group, through some kind of explicit or not explicit at all decision process that's kind of unfolds. Just because of the power of the situation, us being in this room, that makes something to us, even if we protest internally. I don't want to say who we have because it's awkward to say for the first time. And that often also emerges not because of the individual actions, because it's at the level of analysis. We haven't really studied that extensively, but I don't disagree with you. I think it's possible. And what I find interesting as psychologists, that it's sort of like, again, it comes back to this kind of knowing when to engage versus knowing, for instance, or to let it go, let it unfold. And again, that's sort of like where this metacognitive process comes in, reading the room, reading the situation, trusting that it potentially will go in the right direction, even if you don't 100% all the time give 100%. Which is, I find, for instance, early on as a scientist, thinking that I have to constantly control and help my students every single moment of their life. And later I realized actually that you don't have to. And so like, and you have to sometimes let them do their own thing and develop and bring it back to you. And that realization is very similar to what you're saying about the group performance, where you just have to let it go. And because it will unfold regardless. The world will not stop if you don't engage, just because you don't give your 100% every single moment of your time. Anyways, that's my immediate reaction to that. But I don't know if research that actually looked at it extensively. Very interesting.
Zach?
So this is somewhat of an extension on what you said. I think when I hear wisdom, I think some people treat it as like a holy grail, whereas in my opinion, it's like there's an objective set of approaches on how to do a thing, make a decision. What wisdom is simply knowing what the most optimal approach is, or option based on the agent's values, beliefs, and what the context of the situation is. So given an agent's values, beliefs, and then the situation, they sort this set of approaches or options to pick, and then that's the one that they should know. The wisdom is simply just being aware of that option. And for humans, because we're able to convey information to each other, we can just say, oh, given these values and beliefs, the situation, this is the most optimal one. But for animals or creatures who are less cognizant, I'll say, they have to gain that wisdom or awareness of the optimal approach or option through only experience.
Well, there's a reason why we associate wisdom with age. I mean, you know, you see certain things happening over and over and over. They're somewhat similar and some. So you develop a lot of maps.
Yeah.
And as the older you get, you're overlaying these maps.
Sorry.
Wisdom is always fast. It's not this, well, I think it's not this necessarily this arduous process of weighing things,
Yeah.
or not as long as some of the conversations here might suggest.
Two things. One, sorry, go ahead. Continue.
I was just gonna ask a question, like something that in my thinking I've kind of explored as the impact of experience and being aware of the optimal approach or option, and how that trains people's instincts and intuition on how they're acting in the moment. An example that I use when I talk about this is like a salesperson when they're trying to make a call, convince a client, they'll subconsciously be aware of the temperature of the room, how the other person is looking, what they're wearing, all of these like little factors, and do like the compute, you know, that is the brain, it'll output like the perfect string of words and body movements to convince the person to like take the product.
Sorry, not to be nitpicky, but, you know, when you were talking about, us communicating our experience to each other and, us not having that, privilege, you're talking about learning, right? So we are capable to learn, from instruction, but, and also.
I would argue that's more, well, what I'm aware of, what that is more training an animal to do something. So without a human, like, if they go through something, like if they learn that this rock is sharp or something, they should avoid it, that's learning experience, and like they'll be like, oh, I step on that and pain happens.
Well, an animal can say to another animal, be careful about that rock, and the animal will be like, all right, I'll stick with it.
Maybe,
And how do
maybe, I don't know.
how do we know that the way humans learn is not training? Because it's learning, right?
I think the one challenge that I have with the word optimal is that like in complex design decision-making, that is not something that we know. Like a part of being human is that we don't know the optimal.
Yeah.
And that's the messy navigation that then wisdom can hopefully enable people to navigate through. Because the not knowing what's optimal is to be human in a way.
Yeah.
And
Well,
so, yeah.
I would say for optimal, it's less knowing the objective, most optimal and option, but more knowing or being aware of the most optimal given what you know.
Right.
The situation.
Yes, the situational, I get that. Like I sometimes use the language now and befitting. What is a befitting response, a befitting situation, a befitting manner, a befitting tone of a particular situation, so that you can achieve X, Y, Z. That's one thing. And the other point about wisdom over time, I don't know if you want to talk about wisdom over time now or perhaps later, but that came up in terms of age or.
I can comment on. Maybe very briefly say that in psychology and decision sciences, the term optimal is reserved for well-defined situations. And that's where sort of this kind of notion of rational approach comes in, but it's almost impossible to use that because sort of that assumes that you can maximize and get the best thing. The interesting contrast there is that often in everyday life, when you make decisions, you don't go for the best thing. You go, some of us, I mean, I'm a horrible maximizer. Like I go to a LCBO and I will be scanning every single thing, giving the highest score on my Vivino app until I find that 99%, whatever. It's horrible. My wife is a satisficer. And in many situations, we are satisficers. What does that mean? And it's exactly this kind of, in messy situations, you just go for what's good enough. The first, you use one of the heuristics, one of the rules of thumb we often use is as soon as you find the first one that is good enough to you, you'll go with it. It's actually a very good strategy, makes some of this type of ill-defined situations. And I'm suffering because I'm like, those people are so happy and I'm so miserable because I keep on looking for the best video on Netflix or the best wine and so on and so forth. So yeah, so that's the distinction, maximizing for optimal and satisfying for this type of wicked, messy, ill-defined.
Several years ago, we had an in-person meeting with the systems group and played a game called Echo Policy, designed by Frederick Bester. And in this game, we were basically able to run a country and allocate its resources. And, you know, over 4 parameters. And there was a way of telling how successful the choice was. And our group actually did better. We got a really good score because we voted on each choice. And there were about, you know, I don't know, a dozen of us or so. And we actually did much better than any individual in terms of, you know, not getting thrown out of the country because the whole thing crashed. And I was wondering in terms of the decision making that this is one of the places where quote unquote diversity helps because you have the different perspectives and the different perspectives, you know, basically pick up different aspects of context and come to a better decision. Has that sort of thing been studied other than the eco policy results?
I don't know all those domains because this goes into sort of like political science and sociology. Some of what you say, if I were to translate it, there are this, what do we call it? We have a large group of people who are debating a particular issue. Can't remember the names. There are those type of exercises, both in the US and here in Canada. We bring in people and we sort of like discuss various politically important issues, and everybody comes to terms and so forth. And the dynamics of that, yeah, have been studied, and it is a little bit along the lines of like increase diversity. That's usually help. Some attempts to sort of improve the technical needs to achieve that as well. But in psychology, yeah, we often focus on the individuals instead of on this type of groups. But in principle, I would agree with you that it should work. Just like I don't know it's off the top of my head. And the term will come back to me.
I think this applies also to a lot of processes. The future search has two groups. One is basically everybody, heavily community members, and the other group is the experts, the architects and engineers and those folks, and they meet together sometimes, and then they go off and they meet separately, and then they come back.
Yeah.
And
right. Yeah, so that's the classic work. This goes back to the founding of the RAND Corporation, so like at the beginning of the Cold War, to figure out what are the best way to elicit experts' opinion from groups of experts, and some of the things that are sort of very important there is like yeah, you want to bring in group perspective, but also groups can also influence each other, or result in so-called group thinking, and that's not really a thing that people think it is. But in a sense that you're just like subject to whatever the majority is doing, and you feel like uncomfortable expressing your opinion from your perspective, dissenting perspective, but the rest of the group thinks differently. So the solution to that is that if you vote in private first, you provide your initial impressions in private, those that are then aggregated anonymously presented to everybody, and then and so like there's several attempts at revisions of this initial approaches, so-called Delphi methods and subsequent expert representation methods, like the job to do that. And that work does exist.
You waiting for Genie to pop out of that?
No, the wisdom genie. It's just blurry. We're testing. We're learning how this. We're using technological humility to learn how an owl device gets blurry or an unblurry. We'll see. Hey, that's a little bit. That's better. Okay, I used a fiber cloth. We can communicate about the feedback or whether that works, and as a group, we can use.
Curious to hear about wisdom over time. Yeah.
Well, what do you want to know about? Yeah.
Intergenerational wisdom, but can you accumulate it, don't store, record it? How do you calculate it? Done studies?
Okay.
Does it evolve?
How do you pass it down?
So when you say that, the term wisdom then jumps and becomes different things, because like for instance, intergenerational wisdom, there we actually really talk more about knowledge, and it's transmitted often from elders or from previous generations, right? That's very different from what we talked about here. It was like context sensitivity and collective wisdom and so on. It's a different sort of processes. Often, the way I try to make sense of it in the more recent work is when my colleagues and I talk about, there are this kind of set of rules, or so-called we call it, it's silly, it's called object level, but it's what it really means is that for a given task, there would often be some piece of wisdom, be it a heuristic, like that I just mentioned, just go with whatever the best one, the first one that you like, that satisfies that go with that. Like there are a lot of heuristics like that you can live your life by. Or a narrative, political narrative that may help a political leader, or just a story that you heard that was passed on from one generation to another. Or a set of narratives that are often passed on from one generation to the next. Now that and those can accumulate and be culturally transmitted, like over time, they can develop. They can get lost and extinguish, and there may be nothing left because that group doesn't exist anymore. Doesn't speak the language. It's not allowed to speak the language anymore. So it's forth. But the problem with those object level or task level features of wisdom is that in most often they are for specific situations. The narrative that helps you in this context will fail miserably in another context. The heuristic that tells you that you should be satisficing and be happy with whatever the first thing is may work beautifully in many situations, and yet there will be a bunch of situations where actually it will fail, where you should really go for the best, go for the for your aspiration instead of be satisfied with the first thing that you achieve or the first thing that you see. So that's a problem for metacognition, because metacognition tries to tell you, first of all, well, how does the story, how does this narrative, how this culturally transmitted piece of knowledge fits a given situation, whether you should be using it or not. The other issue is that often we have multiple conflicting pieces of elders' wisdom or folk wisdom. In many situations, there are often two stories that will be conflicting with each other, and you don't know which one to go with, or multiple heuristics that could also clash. And again, you need to figure out which one do you select, and especially if it's a wicked problem, how do you go to navigate that without this type of metacognitive discrimination, which can, by the way, happen very, very quickly. It doesn't require you to be sort of like meditating for hours. And often we are doing it almost intuitively, actually. This recognition of limits of knowledge doesn't have to be, oh, do I know something about it or not? Maybe there's just uneasy feeling. I should not say yet. I should maybe look further or not. So that's where this kind of the second form of wisdom comes in, right? Like, so anyway, so that's my current thinking about this. So I totally agree that these forms of wisdom play a role, but often they're not wise, in the sense that they are not fitting the situation. And without this kind of regulatory framework that you have in your mind, and you will not be able to apply them effectively all the time.
Hopefully this question doesn't make me sound like a grumpy man. A few of the things that you mentioned around like, the conditions for wisdom, indicators of wisdom, seem to be counter to the contract.
Yes.
And that's not the manual. And the one in particular where you were talking about metacognition on, part of it is our ability to decide when we take in information and when we talk. Like that seems something like right now, we're losing our ability to regulate. We're hearing talking books. Has there been any, you talked about studies on, can it get better at wisdom, or is it getting better? Is there any in the wisdom study space related to what's going on right now? Who's social media with that?
Well, it's hard to say. And in part, that's related to the question about time, because the treatment of the discussion of social media studies and the effects of social media on human psychology is very complex, in part because you can't really randomly assign people to, here, use this as much as you can versus don't use this at all. Because people still live in a particular cultural space and also because of the dynamic. So most of the data and most of those who you see on social media talking about how we should ban smartphones and so on and so forth, rely on data that actually has no business telling you anything about the causal direction. And most meta-analytic studies that aggregate across multiple studies suggest that it's often very, very complicated. Some groups, social media tools can be empowering. For others, they can be crippling. For some, they may be increasing your ability to interact with others because you may be living in very remote spaces and whatever. For others, they may be converting you into sort of a Homer Simpson who doesn't think at all and just scrolls and pushes the wrong button and like and so on. So it's complicated. So I don't know my current read of that literature in general, and that's not applicable to wisdom or metacognition. You can speculate. I can speculate. Say, yeah, people constantly just consume without reflecting. Yeah, that makes them dumb. If they're delegating any type of formulating of emails now to ChatGPT because they don't even want to, all those uncomfortable emails that we don't want to write, maybe we just ask ChatGPT to write those for us. Well, think about that. What will that do to you if you lose that ability to regulate yourself and think through how you're supposed to be reacting to complex, messy situation? You lose that ability, like any other ability, where it requires training, it requires practice. So I do worry about it, but empirical evidence so far is just, it depends. As for many things, it depends on how we use it. I don't think that social media companies care about it, but I think it's more like a social critic type of perspective, because that's not the business model. I do think that a lot of them do care about building in metacognition into their systems, but not for reasons that they should care about them. They do that because that's the only way to improve their models, not necessarily because they want to save humanity.
Yeah, you were talking about humility and wisdom, and I was curious your opinion as a psychologist, like, if maybe sometimes like the lack of humility actually leads to the result, and like, so two subjective things that I hear all the time is, if you're someone that has a belief in a greater power, believe that when you die, you go to heaven or whatever it is, if you believe you have a purpose in life, then you will, have like a better quality of life, even though you should know that there's no way to actually know if that's true. And then the other side is like, as an athlete, you're a professional athlete, highly competitive. If you have a mentality that you are going to win or you are dominant, and you don't focus on your negatives or the things that you know might be weakness, that typically leads to you having better performance.
I don't necessarily disagree with any of what you said. I think you can have both. There's also a big distinction. Like, I'm not talking about humility as a kind of social construct that is often associated with sort of religious teaching, especially in Christian dogma. I specifically talk about this kind of jargon term, intellectual humility or epistemic humility. There's kind of recognition of limits of your knowledge, which can happen even pretty fast, and recognition that you may be wrong or you may fail. I think it's high performance athletes are hyper aware of that. In fact, that is what's driving. I'm a former athlete myself. I mean, like, that's what drives you. It's like, I will fail this tournament. And so you have to figure out how to motivate yourself. You may think that you're the best, but at the same time, it would be absolutely foolish not to work on your mistakes, right? And so that is the form of humility that we're talking about. The other thing that you're mentioning is more this kind of sense of autonomy, sense of purpose, absolutely. I think it's probably a fundamental thing to all humans that we need to have, be self-directed, a sense that we know where we're going in some ways. But that doesn't mean that you cannot check on whether you're right or wrong, and sometimes ask for directions, right? In fact, that may help you figure out who you're right. So I don't know if those are necessarily in conflict with each other. But again, like, it's not about sort of that religious humility that is often conflated with intellectual humility, which I, by the way, don't have anything against. It's just that, I think it's a different construct. It's sort of like often this kind of religious humility, which sounds weird, but it comes often from contemplative tradition. That version of humility is often about being nice and not self-aggrandizing. And that I can totally see how somebody can be self-aggrandizing in public and then come back home, it's like, oh no, I still checks on whether be fully aware they have bullshit. Right? So so they would have that intellectual process going on, even though socially they would be presenting themselves there.
You might be the right person to answer these questions. So wisdom is called Sophia in Attic Greek. My question is wisdom the same as truth? Is it the same as a search for truth? Because we've had scientific methods for a long time, more than 200 years. We use scientific methods to get the truth about the external world, nature, really, processes of nature. Science's goal is to find the truth about the world and the universe. So is wisdom the same as this search for truth?
So it's complicated. And the reason it's complicated is because actually in Greek, there are two terms for wisdom. There's Sophia. It's actually linked to what you were saying earlier about Solomon. Understanding the deep fundamental nature of the universe, the eternal truth about the world. Now, that term was very appealing to Christians, and hence Aristotelian thinking about that was adopted as a backbone of Christian philosophy. But in addition to this Sophia idea, which actually does refer to this notion of like relationship to this statement, the relationship to this kind of universal truth, Aristotle talks about pronesis as a practicalism that you apply. Now, one can interpret Solomon as showing Sophia in understanding the deep nature of humans. But of course, one can also, and probably should also, interpret his actions as understanding the context and the practicalities of what the real mother and somebody who pretends will do. And so often that example is used more as an example of the pronesis, practical wisdom, things that you need in everyday life to navigate challenging decisions that you're facing, kind of weaker problems and so on. So there's that distinction. Now that's what Aristotle thought, but who cares what Aristotle thought? He was just one guy who lived 3,000+ years ago. I mean, there are many other philosophers, many other people, and certainly one can interpret and take that label, Sophia, or notion of pursuit of truth, and link it to a modern understanding of wisdom. And in fact, it is correct. When we survey people, both lay people and academics, and ask them, okay, what is wisdom about? Many of them would say it's about pursuit of truth. And that is the moral standard, a moral grounding of a lot of ideas. I would not disagree with that. I would say that probably a lot of this kind of medical features beyond just regulation, they help you to discern and get to a better perspective on what may be true and what may not be true. How to sort of avoid some of the biases and illusions you may otherwise be succumb to. But for Aristotle, there was this kind of separation with Sophia, for instance, which is very funny because then sort of like, well, what does philosophy actually then mean? Pursuit of universal truth, but what is actually universal? What are those deep existential things about the nature of the universe? and should we be only interpreting them from the last ancient Greeks who were wrong about most things? Physics and chemistry, I don't know, but that's the original philosophical background. I could be aware of it, and like humbly.
Yeah, we can go.
Okay.
Sure. Thank you very much. I think that I have a bunch of kind of more questions, which is good. But I guess the clearest one that I can ask, when you looked at culture, different cultures with regards to this topic, have you found the difference in terms of masculine, feminine? It kind of goes back to what we are looking at in terms of someone's yin yang and that flow. But I don't know, even over time, whether there's something that is different because of power structures or soft powers and, like you said, over time that if you play nice, then you win in the long term.
Yeah, I mean, it's got to be a lot of layers. So I think like probably the denominator of what you're saying is about social structures and the role of power. Yeah, or are you more interested in the gender or sex?
No, not in the sexual, but masculine, feminine,
Masculine.
and just with a basis of masculine being more self and feminine being others.
Right, okay. No, that's a stereotype. I mean, to some extent it's true, not necessarily, even like, for instance, stereotypes about men talking less than women.
Not men and women, but masculine.
Masculine, feminine, yeah. So, but, okay, so if you go away from the gender stereotypes, I think what you're talking about, sort of like being self-focused versus outside-focused, yes. We have done research on that and sort of manipulated that. It's linguistic shifts and visual shifts, and it does matter. And like it goes back even to this idea about Solomon's sort of like paradox that I mentioned earlier. So like when you're dealing about the same issue, presumably, but it is your issue, you're much less likely to admit your mistakes. You're much less likely to perspective take. You're much less likely to seek compromise than if it is an issue of somebody else. And why? Because you look at it from this kind of outwardly, what you would call more feminine perspective. Whereas the masculine would be much more sort of self-centered, just about you. So yeah, we've seen that. We've also seen some effects of social status, where higher status people are less likely to engage in this process, maybe because they don't need to, because they can get away without it. We've also seen that if there's a status differential and it is work conflict with your boss, you're much more likely, or your supervisor, you're much more likely to engage in this metacooperative process compared to when it's a work conflict with your subordinate. Again, probably because you can get away with it. So some of that, yes, you've seen. I've also seen that, for instance, in this is the opposite of that. For instance, in Honduras, we found the range of studies in rural Honduras, like we mapped out a region, rural region, mostly farmers, where we looked at, asked people about the disagreements that they have in their lives with somebody. And then we checked on whether they were checking whether their opinions were correct in those disagreements. And probed intellectual humility, so to say, and perspective taking of different. And how shocked found that women were less likely to engage in those two men. Gee, we'll never get that published. That's horrible. And then I started looking what kind of conflicts do people recall, because it's all concrete disagreements or differences in opinion. And it turned out that women were more likely to report disagreements with either their children or somebody who is less sort of like basically where they have a higher relational status than the person they have a difference of opinion. Whereas for men, it was their boss, their body, and some kind of sports club, and so on and so forth. So once again, that this relational dynamic emerged, where actually all that gender or sex difference, in this case, actually, I don't think we can discriminate. It's not about sex, but I think it was gender. Was mostly because of different relational situations, one and another would recall. Just kind of interesting.
I was going to ask the question whether or not wisdom can be unlearned. So once you gain wisdom, whether or not you can lose it, and then the distinction between Sophia and phronesis came up, and that made me think of fast-moving layers and slow-moving layers, right? So like fast-moving layers, phronesis, right? It changes. So my grandmother, she can possibly give me advice on, like the
How to use our technology.
yeah, exactly. But, I go to my grandma when I really need to make a deep life decision. Better, so the relationship between, and then I thought back to, what we were talking about is humans and, non-humans, right? And the level of complexity. And then Elena brought up, Elena brought up, working in groups, being more of a so I think there's a definite relationship between wisdom and complexity. So, it's on the tip of my tongue. So, and then that made me think, oh, well, with systems theory, we're definitely on the right track, to gaining wisdom.
Let me interject, if I actually published on this. So you're talking about phronesis. And so in 2013, I published a paper on episteme, techne, and phronesis. And so episteme described as know why, techne as knowing how, but then phronesis as knowing when, where, and who. And the problem we actually have in the system thinking community is too much episteme and too much techne, not enough phronesis. But this raises the question to me about, and we're interested to have everyone have a discussion about whether systems thinking, which is thinking more about wholes, holistic thinking, these sorts of things, ecology, is more metacognition. And so by having systems thinking, are we actually approaching a way of improving our metacognition? That's open to everybody, because everyone here is like, it's been around systems, so.
At least, I mean, as an empirical scientist, I would say like that leads itself to a beautiful study. One could do. I mean, conceptually, I would think that, if you start thinking outside of the box and start thinking about multiple boxes, multiple frames, of course, that makes you more metacognitive. It has to, right? Because you start considering different ways to conceptualize the same issue from different angles. You start engaging with different stakeholders or with different perspectives. So I would say yes, but I'm not a systems. I mean, I drew systems in some of my papers. Baby systems, circles and circles. So that ecological.
So I think you're gonna spend 2 years learning how to do that, so.
Right. I mean, I think one thing that I'm not sure if you could tell me more from systems thinking sort of perspective is this temporal dimension. How much do you engage with how the system evolves and changes over time?
One thing you should mention that. So that is exactly the 10-year research project, which we're in year 7, so we're working on that. But yes, and that's why we moved over from Western philosophy and toward processual philosophy, because we're trying to capture that. But given that all of us in this room, I think, are Western trained, it's tough. It's tough to make that jump.
I want to just offer something to the conversation from like a design perspective or a systemic design perspective and like in terms of hormesis and practicality of where we are today. And let's say we're talking about Canada and the landscape of, let's say, political dialogue or the political systems that have a dialogue over it. I'm going to offer an idea, and we'd love to get a wisdom studies professor perspective on it, but also others, is we talked a lot about how we reward the confidence exuding posture. So if someone expresses confidence, that is what many people gravitate towards. And you see that play out very recently in the thing called like political platforms, for example. Our approach is this, we're going to solve this, et cetera, et cetera. In the system's history, and I guess overall tendency, there's Churchman, what's Churchman's first name? West Churchman, on the first name, but West Churchman is this idea of a multi-paradigm inquiry. So you're designing an inquiry. So there's different paradigms, and you'll correct me on all of them, but like, you know, there's the statistical like average of what people are seeing. There's like a voting, a kind of a group consensus form, and there's the dialectic version. So like two people debate, or like the Hegelian version where you're kind of like arguing the points.
Yep.
But the point is to sweep through all of them. And you're trying to appreciate that there's multiple paradigms by which people are making sense of the world. And my design suggestion or idea or encouragement is, can we mess with democracy now as it is? Can we like poke fun at it and rewire it so that we can create almost a political theory of inquiry? And so it's the quality of inquiry that becomes competitive. How well do you compete on sweeping in multiple paradigms to understand something, even as reductive as, let's just take something very local. Are the bike lanes causing congestion or not? You know, like literally there is a paradigm that says my storefront needs the following type of traffic. And my truth regime makes me believe that when I see this type of traffic, therefore I think bike lanes are a disruption to it, and blah, blah, blah. Another person will argue. But right now in the entire ecology, all you're doing is getting the one tip of the iceberg that's like, but bikes are doing this, or but they are encouraging more, or they are actually helpful, and they're like, everyone's just fighting on different like paradigms and different epistemologies. So that's why I think there's a huge potential for wisdom through the lens of intellectual humility to actually say, the best thing we can do is look into this really well together so that you can dissolve some of the issues. And you're actually not like punching down or saying, how foolish of you, how could you do that? I don't think that's a legitimate way of actually dissolving points of view. It's actually understanding, oh, you thought that because you felt this way, you see this. Gotcha, okay. What if we connected to this? What do we both see now? Very idealistic, I get it. But that's my idea of connecting systemic design as an inquiry with wisdom studies and intellectual humility.
It's cool. I know, how exactly do you envision the, because we take what way, so if we have debate, you have, you know, just a simple voting,
Consensus.
the consensus. How exactly do you envision bringing them together?
Yes.
Do you have a secret sauce?
I mean, there's, you know, it's funny, like, sometimes I try to look at who does this, who does close to this really well, and of course, like, the idea of journalistic practices and collective information gathering, whether it's researchers and academics or others. I like Steve Aiken on TVO. You know, I don't know if you heard, he like brings in a bunch of people, but it's still not close enough, right? It's not there yet. So I'm just being imaginative, is you may have to do pre-conversation surveying to bring that stimulus into the survey. And then you would have a gradient of opinions. And you would bring folks from those gradients of opinions, and you'd have the stimulus of surveys and consensus that they're responding to, but they're also giving their perspective over. And I would say Churchman, who developed this in the 60s, I'm like, you're outdated. There's a little bit of updates that we've got to do, right? He's long since deceased now, but I'm just saying some of those updates are like, you need one way of meta cognitive understanding is, can you gradient dart make the best argument for the point you disagree with of gradient white? And it exercises the metacognition.
I see. It's similar to what some scholars call the ideological Turing test.
Okay,
So it's basically like, because the Turing test, so that they can convince will the AI be able to pass as a human, right? Ideological Turing test is essentially, can you convince the other side of the spectrum? What kind of arguments would you need to use that they would actually find appealing
right.
and be able to?
And that requires you knowing
Yeah,
what
exactly.
their strongest
And forces
argument
you to
is.
actually seriously engage with their perspective instead of just dismissing them as idiots.
Right. And so that would be a mechanism by which you would just have to potentially appreciate why their truth regime allows them to arrive at what we are now observing only a headline level argument. You know what I mean? Like there's no depth to the conversation. And so I don't know, maybe this is a 8-hour marathon discussion broadcasting, you know, I don't know, I'm not sure, but some type of mechanism like that to try to bring it together. So, but my point is maybe not literally this idea, but the relationship between systems thinking, design, and obviously the nature of inquiry, how that relates to wisdom.
You're also reflecting that a group of us just spent 5 days in Iowa in a retreat. And so the amount of time we have to explore all those different paths is a luxury that we actually usually don't get. So, so metacognition only comes with time, effort.
Or with practice. I mean, again, like I don't think perspective taking requires a lot of practice. Sometimes you just refuse to take somebody's perspective, period, because you don't agree with us. You would just whatever. They are them, we are us, and we don't talk. Right? And that's so beautiful conflicts and prejudice along the areas, dimensions, racial, political, they're often like that. So we just don't engage in it whatsoever. But if you were, perspective taking doesn't cost that much, if you think about it. Because we're very good at that, compared to many other species. So I don't think all of this requires huge amount of practice. But of course, deliberation has a cost. And even thinking whether you may be wrong, sometimes does have a cost.
Right.
You start thinking about that.
I think that's where the confidence posture comes in because it rewards exuding confidence.
Right.
And I wonder what would it take to reward exuding humility or inquiry or humbleness. And you mentioned I think the Denmark example and things like that. And I think whether or not much of our society recognizes it, I think that is the ailment that is perhaps like unseen. Is like there's a conversation that is continuing to reward confidence even now, and maybe at a political level. And I wonder what does it look like to reward humility?
Yeah, I mean to some extent, it's sort of a combination of some social media studies and psychology, and some of the ecosystems that we set up on social media, and the reason why it's sort of so polarized to an extent is because when we have the bias towards the negative information, and the stronger is negative information, the more we will oscillate to it. That's sort of an evolutionary bias. You gotta know if you're being eaten by somebody or if there's danger. And that's much more important as a signal than, oh, this is a nice beach, but this beach is even nicer. Oh, this coconut is wonderful. Oh, this coconut is amazing. No, you need to know if it's a rotten coconut or not a rotten coconut. That's how you discriminate. And so we have this bias. If you get the negative information, we are much more drawn to it. And we will engage with it more. The platforms, even if they're designed totally egalitarian and don't prioritize whatever they prioritize it, would nevertheless then learn from that, from our biases, and retrieve our biases and therefore amplify. Now, that's a system. Those people who want to promote their narrative, what do? They right away just think, so I have to be A, more negative, and B, stronger. in my voice, because like if I use some kind of additional uncertain elements in it, nobody will, caveats, nobody will listen to.
I'm wondering if we're reaching a point of hypercynicism that actually will find that refreshing. That's what I'm wondering. I'm wondering, have we reached a point where we're saying, this confidence is boring me?
We're actually approaching time, so I'm gonna give Anna one last shot.
Okay, oh, I see. Okay, if you, what you're saying, or, are you not contradicting yourself a little bit, because, remember you brought up, game theory and, wisdom of collaboration only comes through after a certain number of rounds that you play.
Yeah.
And.
From a rational, so that would be if you were, even if you didn't have any moral qualms and you just care about yourself, you would still be collaborating. But it doesn't mean that people are not intuitively, from the beginning, sometimes trying to play nice. And actually, that's another set of game theoretical studies that suggest that quite often the best strategy is to start nice and only to start punishing if others are.
But you only find that, even in game theory, you only find that out after you solve the whole problem. Well, because as I said, the narcissist type is rewarded, right?
Yeah.
But how do we reward humility? And you're arguing that humility is connected to the, optimal or whatever we want to call the results that are connected to the goal, right? So isn't it just dependent on the number of rounds that you play? So narcissists can benefit in a short study, right? And then humility is not connected to moral, because if it's connected to the deeper truth of how the slow layers of this society work, then it will win out the slower you get.
So, no, you're absolutely right, and just very quickly, the point is that the criticism of social media platforms is that they would say it's supernatural, because in the real world, you would be corrected and punished.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So in the real world, we have these interactions, and then somebody, oh no, you screwed me up. No, screwed me over. I will not play with you.
That
That's
system
it.
has completely different alien
It's
dynamics.
completely different dynamics of social media. At least that's one of the sort of social differences. So,
Like a different planet, okay.
Okay, so we're at time. No, sorry, we're at time. So there's a formal part, there's an informal part. So for anyone that wants to continue discussion, I think we'll go to Ginger, it's up on Queen Street. It's a Vietnamese restaurant, it's relatively cheap. You don't have to all eat if you have another reason not to eat, but that's where we're gonna hang out. So I'd like to thank Igor and Zaid for today's discussion, and anyone join us, please do.